Welcome to Voices in the Wilderness, conversations about church and leader health. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. We also welcome any comments or suggestions. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org. My name is Marcus Carlson, and I'm here along with our podcast guru, Peter Belschwinder. And today, the two of us, instead of having a guest, are going to have a conversation about a topic that we have found interesting. So, Peter, excited to have a chat about this today.
Yeah, we're here to talk about a really fun topic. I think it's talking about the theory of thirds. But first, as leaders, it's really easy for us to see negatives rather than positives. So, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, that pretty much defines my life in ministry. I think, if I'm honest, I actually just had somebody last night. Please don't let the 2% live in your head instead of the 98%. I think it's our natural tendency is human beings, as fallen human beings. It is our tendency, I believe, to look at the negative over the positive. And I think this is actually more profoundly true in the church, especially the American church. We're always focusing on our weaknesses or what went wrong or where we failed. And I'm not saying we ignore those things. I want to constantly reflect on what could be better, what went wrong, what I could do differently. I want to be aware of my weaknesses and my rough edges and my mistakes and my tendencies for sin. At the same time, I think when we focus on those, we lose sight. And again, I'm very much like that. I'm a very driven person. I care deeply about the stuff that I do. I constantly want to be better, and I think that this is where the enemy, I believe, distracts us. Right? That John 10:10, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and I have come that you may have life and life abundant or to the full, as Jesus said. And what I tell people all the time is, I think this steal, kill, and destroy, if that's the goal of the enemy, I think the technique is to demean, to distract, and to divide. And so for me as a leader, those negative things often become the things that demean or distract, or if they're with somebody else, can divide. And what I've learned far too late in my career is I need to focus more on my strengths than my weaknesses. Again, being aware of the weaknesses and finding people around me to help them. But I am a total hypocrite if I were to say, listen to the positive voices primarily, not only. That would be a very hypocritical statement, and anyone who spent more than a day with me would recognize that. And it was been my weekend in ministry, focused entirely on kind of the negative voices instead of the positive ones, even though it's an overwhelming majority.
Yeah, same. I know it's one of those things that we're working on in our spiritual and character development in seminary is to, how do we differentiate those voices? So I guess that's the question to you is how do you know what voices to listen to and give power to as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that you can grow in, but you'll never bat 1,000, to use a baseball analogy. And in some senses, I think everyone deserves to be heard. You should listen to all voices. Uh, that in the Old Testament, God spoke through asses, and He's been doing it ever since, present company included. And so, I think everyone deserves to be heard. And so, listening to all voices, I think, is critical. But the key is the filtering, right? That there is almost always a kernel of truth in everything, whether it's positive feedback or negative feedback or neutral feedback, if there is such a thing in our culture today, that there's always a kernel of truth in that. And so I think that, you got to listen to all voices. But I also think that the bigger question is, what voices do you give power to? That's where the trick is. I think the first trick is the filtering, because everything should be heard, and there's got to be a kernel of truth in almost everything. But what do you give power to? And I remember one of the most profound moments of my ministry. I was working for a pastor who was very difficult to work for, borderline abusive. And I was complaining to a friend about it. And he said to me, I mean, this has been more than a decade ago, and I can still remember where I was sitting, what the air smelled like. One of those moments, he said, "Well, can I ask you a hard question?" Of course, you're never supposed to say no to that if you're,
Right.
a leader. And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Why do you give this man so much power over your life?" And it may just cut right to the heart of everything that, I don't have a lot of choices in this world. I think we are delusioning ourselves to think that we have lots of choices, but I do think we have a ton of choice in terms of, what voice we give power to, what voices we give power to. I have a friend, and I'm not sure I agree with this 100%, but I have a close friend who's been on the podcast that says, I don't give much weight to input from somebody I wouldn't go to for advice. I'm not sure I'd take it that far, but I think there's some wisdom in that filter, uh, for sure. But one of the questions I ask myself is: this person really for me, or are they for something that I'm about? Right? Are they for the kingdom, or for this church we're working with together, or are they for themselves or something else? But I think that's one of the questions I ask. Right? You know, does this person see me for who I really am, or try to see me for who I really am? But in a very consumer culture, I think in the church, we always listen to the squeaky wheel. We always listen to those negative voices, and we give them so much power. And again, Jesus had the critics, the politicians and the religious people were his biggest critics. And so I feel in really good company some days. And in the end, it was the religious people and the politicians that worked together to crucify them. So a history lesson we continue to not learn. But yeah, I think it's really just having the honest, like, is this a person that's invested in my life? And recognizing, yeah, we're all accountable to one another, but accountability is about relationship. It's not about policing. And so for me, when I'm listening to voices, I want to think primarily about relationship, right? Is this a person who knows me, who's for the kingdom? Is this a person that I've given that authority over my life? And I remind people, the Holy Spirit's in charge of our own sin management. Obviously, we play a role in that, but besides that, it's the people that we invite to that. And recently I was listening to a podcast, and they talked about the rule of thirds and using an Italian flag. And this has actually been really helpful. And I don't know, even the podcast, the person doing the podcast, couldn't remember, where this rule of thirds come, or this principle of thirds. But you imagine an Italian flag, we'll try to put one up here. Yeah, we got one up, but if you're listening instead of watching, it's three horizontal equal sized bars. There's a green on the left, white in the middle, red on the right. I'm not Italian. Peter's got a little Italian. I use my hands and talk with my hands like I'm an Italian, but nonetheless. And really the idea is, in an organization, but especially a church, but in any organization, uh, where the voices we listen the most to determine a lot. So what happens is, if the green represents the positive voices, and again, not just positive feedback, but they are for, the organization, for the leaders. The white represents those who are kind of neutral, right? And the red represents those who are critical. And again, always critical, never happy, always find something kind of thing. And every organization have them. In the church, it doesn't feel like it's equal. The reality is it probably is. It's just that red side of the flag is pretty loud. Red is a loud color. And so what happens with this rule of thirds, or the principles of thirds, is if leaders listen primarily to the voices in the green, what happens is that those in the white, the neutral, they go, oh, that's where we're going. Oh, that's how we get attention. And so then they lean into being positive voices, where half the red also then lean into being the positive voice, or even at least being neutral. And the other half of the red either depart or quiet down. right? That people will behave based on what gets them attention and power and kind of noticing, right? And so if we're constantly listening to the red voices, to the negative voices, what happens is the people in the neutral go, oh, well, that's how we get attention and how we get heard and noticed. So then they become negative, and then half the greens go, okay, well, if that's what we've got to do, they either become neutral and kind of say, all right, whatever, or they join those red voices. And then the other half of the green leave. And a lot of times those are healthy people. And so we wonder in churches sometimes, like, why we're unhealthy. I think part of it is we just lean so much into the negative voices, right? I'm working, I'm working with churches. I see this all the time. And I've even heard in board meetings in one church, it's like, oh, we used to sit here and take an hour to make one small decision because we were going through every objection and every person that might be mad or every person that might disagree. And not only did it take them an hour to make a simple decision, it didn't work anyway. Right. And so then all of a sudden they're like, why is there so much negativity? Well, where do you put the power? And so this rule of thirds has been really good for me. Again, one of those things I wish I leaned into and learned earlier in my career. One of the things I've not done well over the past couple of days in my own life and ministry. But how do we lean into those positive voices? That for me as a leader, everyone is equal, and I don't see anyone as more important or more powerful than other. But over time, I do tend to listen to people more that are invested, right? That are in the throes of things, that are a part of it, that are deeply committed, that are not the consumers. And I think that's the consumer mindset, right? Our consumer mindset is to focus on the red. And consumerism has no place in the church. I'm not even sure it's doing great for us as a country in the United States. But growing up, I worked at Burger King, and it's like the motto was "Have it your way, right away." And I think that sometimes that feels like the motto of the American Christian church.
Yeah, I'm extremely guilty of looking to buy products or going to restaurants, and I am on Yelp. I am looking at the reviews. I am, always looking at the reviews on Amazon, and it's always like, let me filter by recent, but also let me filter the negative ones because I want to see what their experience was in a bad way. I don't know what it is. It's just like a natural thing where it's like, I want to see the worst here. Um, it's just,
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're cynical. I don't know. My
I
wife does the
am,
same
I
thing,
am.
and I point out to her, that might be the reason. But I get it, because I think we do. Again, it's not that those voices don't matter, right? But again, where's our focus and energy? And again, even those in the green say critical things, right? That this is about, I think, a spirit of belief and support and positivity towards the organization and its leaders versus the red. It's not just positive and negative feedback, although the red is almost always negative with a few positives, and the green is almost always positive with a few negatives. And I do think that there is more good than bad in the world. There's more good than bad in our churches, that we are abundantly blessed, especially in the United States. And so I do think that there's more positive to see, eh, though I confess that maybe I'm too optimistic sometimes.
Well, I was going to say, I think both the green and the red have people who are completely delusional about how bad things are and how good things are. And that's why it's good to have that center bar of neutral people that can just bring it, like reel some people in. Like, hey, it's not as bad as that, or hey, it's not as good as the way you see things right now. No, there is some bad, there is some good. Like, those people are really valuable. And I think those are the voices sometimes that we just completely overlook in the church because they're usually the quietest ones, in my opinion, is like from what I've seen in my experience, the ones that are in the neutral, they're afraid to speak up because they get bombarded by both sides. Um, so,
And
but
in
you're
my
right,
experience, a
those
lot of the neutral people just don't care. They're just there. I mean,
that
not that
too,
maybe they don't care deeply. I'm not
that
saying they
too.
don't care at all, right? I mean, there's some of that too. And I think maybe given an issue, some people might be in different parts of the flag. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, we always talk about the Stockdale paradox in our ministry. Jim Collins wrote about it in Good to Great. And Stockdale was an admiral in the Vietnam War who was a POW with John McCain and others. And the Stockdale paradox is that we confront reality and point towards hope, or we name reality and point towards hope. And certainly, the rule of thirds is not to say you don't deal with negative things, or you don't deal with improvement, or you don't deal with criticism. That's not healthy. But again, which set of voices gets most attention, right? So it's just like a kid when they're bad. Like if they do a certain thing and it gets them attention, they'll keep doing it. I remember when our kids were young, one of our kids in particular, anytime they get hurt, if we gasped, they started crying. But if we didn't react, they didn't start crying.
Yeah.
And I thought most of the time, I mean, obviously, like if you're got a concussion, you're going to cry regardless. But I think, but most of the time it's like, but again, how do we not react? Because it's like, oh, that's our kid and they just hit their head and that looked like that hurt. Right. And so I think that that's part of it too, right? That it's that how we react will kind of like create people's behaviors. And it goes back to what I said earlier. It's not just, what do we give power to? Do we give power to the potential? Do we give power to the invested, or do we give power to the critical and the uninvested? And I think again, it's not just whether they're positive or negative. These thirds, I think, are also, at least for me, about the level of investment.
Yeah. So good. Agree with it all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start teaching this more because I wish more organizations, had the opportunity to kind of think about this again. What are we leaning into? Are we leaning into the positive invested voices, or are we leaning into the kind of negative consumeristic voices? And really, this can dictate kind of the health and the direction. And I think while this is this theory, this principle, whatever you call it, is really about organizations. I think it's true in my own life. And again, it's ironic that this is what we're talking about, because I've not had a good week with this, that it's very easy for us, to get distracted.
Yeah, there was one thing I was going to say earlier, and you just reminded me of it, is like when you give voice to, or you listen to one of those voices of positivity or negativity. And I was doing ministry yesterday, and was praying for a lady with another. I didn't know who they were, right? And the one girl said, when those negative voices, you give them power, one of the things that you can do individually is to take some time and just practice gratitude, right? So take a pause and just say, Lord, well, I'm grateful that you did this, or I'm grateful for this. Like, if you have a great house, be thankful for it. Like, exercise those moments of gratitude, and that will start to negate those negative voices. And it was one of those things where it's like, I've heard it before so many times, and I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And it was well received by those by the woman that we were praying for. So it's just, yeah, having those moments of gratitude too. I wonder, in church and leader health, how many times we practice gratitude as an organization of like, are we thankful for what God has done? Like, obviously you don't want to live in the past, right? But there is some validity to looking back and saying, thank you, Lord, for blessing us when you did this and when you did this, and you're continuing to do this. I think that could really put to bed some of those negative red stripe people in the church.
Yeah, I think in the church, even though we have the joy of Jesus in our heart, and I forget who said it, but it's like, if you have the joy of Jesus in your heart, you might want to notify your faces, right? And it always gets a laugh, but it's that awkward laugh. And I don't think it's just gratitude about the past, but how do we celebrate the present? I think in churches we are terrible about celebration, and ironically, that's sad because we have more to celebrate than anyone in the world. And so I wonder about that. I think it might have been John Ortberg in his book on the spiritual disciplines that talked about this idea that, we really are terrible as the American Christian church, the church in the United States of celebrating. We just either get in routine, or we get stuck in the kind of the muck and mire of the red. And as an anti-Ohio State guy, I always think red is bad. So this analogy really works for me. So shout out to that. But yeah, I think that's part of the challenge, is that we don't celebrate well. We don't. And again, squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? It's that old saying, and I think that that's secretly the mission statement of some churches in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got to do something about it. That's
Well, that's why I'm talking about it. Again, you know, us talking about this, me talking about this, there is some blatant hypocrisy in this. And again, especially in the last week. And so again, what voices do we give power to? I think we listen to all the voices, but what voices do we give power to? And that's the important lesson. Everyone deserves to feel and be heard, but where do we lean in? What do we give power to? Do we give power to the voices that are for us and for the organization, and generally positive, even though they do and should healthily offer some criticism? Or do we give power to the voices that are always negative, almost always selfish, right? And perhaps a bit consumeristic. So just something
yeah,
for our listeners to think about, and for us to remind ourselves of.
yeah. And we need to give power to the voices in the wilderness. Boom.
I love it. Good. Yeah. Well, hey, I mean, those were some important voices. And again, we could divide this flag up, right? The voice of the gospel and the voice of the enemy, right? The voice of abundant life, or the voice that steals, kills, and destroys. And maybe that's one of our filters. Is this giving me life? Is this giving ministry, in the ministry I lead, life? Or is this stealing, killing, and destroying? And maybe that's another filter as we think about, what voices we're listening to. So thanks for making me
Absolutely.
think of that. Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. Again, we welcome comments or suggestions for topics or speakers. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org.